The Academy's mystery student. The morning alarm at Nexus Military Academy pierced through the artificial atmosphere with its familiar shriek. Across the dormitory complex, cadets from 17 different species began their daily routines. Some roared their morning battle cries, others performed ritual combat dances, and a few meditated while floating 3 feet above their beds. In Dormitory Block 7, Room 43, Marcus Thompson simply opened his eyes, sat up, and began making his bed with precise military corners. He had been at the Academy for 6 months, and in that time he had spoken exactly 4 words during official training sessions. The other cadets had been counting. It had become something of a game among them, placing bets on whether the strange human would break his silence during combat drills. So far, nobody had won. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Zorthok, a massive Krillian warrior, standing nearly 9 feet tall, slammed his armored fist on the metal table as he recounted his latest victory in the combat Sibnitas. His species had conquered 12 star systems through pure aggression, and he never let anyone forget it. His voice boomed across the eating area, causing smaller species to unconsciously move away from his table. At a corner table, as far from the noise as possible, Marcus ate his standard ration pack methodically. Each bite was measured, each movement economical. He watched everything. His pale blue eyes tracked conversations, recorded gestures, and catalogued the behavioral patterns of every species represented in the Academy. A small notebook lay beside his tray, and occasionally he would write something down in neat, precise handwriting. Cadet Lyra approached his table, her ethereal form shimmering slightly as she moved. The Scion Collective had sent her to the Academy to learn military tactics, though her people preferred mental warfare to physical combat. Her species communicated primarily through telepathy, making her one of the few beings who might understand Marcus's silence. She sat across from him without invitation. "You know," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "I've tried reading your thoughts dozens of times. There's something blocking me. It's not shields or training. It's something else entirely." Marcus looked up from his food, made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to eating. No words, no acknowledgement, just that brief moment of recognition that he had heard her. Lyra studied his face, searching for any crack in his composed expression. "The others think you're mute," she continued, "or traumatized. Dr. Kane has been asking questions about your psychological profile, but I think you're something else entirely." Marcus finished his meal, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and stood to leave. As he walked past Lyra, he paused for just a moment and spoke in a voice so quiet she almost missed it. "Thinking is not the same as knowing." Those were the first words he had voluntarily spoken to another cadet since arriving at the Academy. The tactical training facility stretched across 3 acres of the Academy's main complex. Commander Vexhai, a reptilian drill instructor whose species had evolved from apex predators, prowled between the training stations. His yellow eyes missed nothing, and his forked tongue constantly tasted the air for signs of fear or weakness. Among his cadets, today's exercise involved close quarters combat scenarios. Each cadet would face off against holographic enemies designed to match their species' natural abilities. The Krillians would face armored opponents requiring brute strength. The Scions would encounter enemies resistant to mental attacks. Insectoid Hive Collective members would fight swarm scenarios, designed to test their coordination abilities. Marcus stood in line with the others, watching each demonstration with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything else. When Zorthok's turn came, the massive warrior roared his battle cry and charged into his simulation. The holographic enemies never stood a chance. His armored fists crushed through their defenses, and his tactical approach was simple but effective. Overwhelm with superior force and never retreat. The other cadets cheered and shouted encouragement. This was what warrior culture looked like, they agreed. This was how battles were won, with strength, with aggression, with the willingness to face any enemy head-on, and never back down. Cadet Thompson, Commander Vex High's voice, cut through. The noise, your turn. The training facility fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The quiet human who never spoke, never boasted, never even raised his voice during the most intense training sessions. Some of the cadets had theories that humans were simply too weak for military service, that their species lacked the natural aggression necessary for warfare. Others suspected Marcus might be some kind of spy or observer, sent to study their techniques rather than participate. Marcus stepped forward and entered the simulation chamber. The holographic enemies materialized around him. A mix of different alien species designed to test adaptability rather than specialize against any particular strength. He stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, simply observing. The enemies began their attack patterns, advancing from multiple angles with coordinated timing. What happened next was unlike anything that observers had ever seen. Marcus moved with fluid precision, not wasting a single motion. He didn't meet the enemies head-on like Zorthok had. Instead, he used their own momentum against them, redirecting attacks and turning their coordination into chaos. He struck pressure points that shouldn't have existed on holographic enemies. Yet somehow his attacks found weaknesses in their programming that even the instructors hadn't known were there. The entire simulation lasted 43 seconds. When it ended, every holographic enemy lay defeated. And Marcus stood in the center of the chamber without a scratch on his uniform. He had not made a single sound during the entire encounter. Commander Vex High stared at the readouts from his monitoring station. The combat efficiency ratings were unlike anything in the Academy's database, but more disturbing was the tactical analysis. The computer showed that Marcus had identified and exploited 17 different weaknesses in the enemy formation. Weaknesses that would have taken seasoned military analysts hours to discover. How did you know about the joint vulnerabilities? In the Krillian anatomy simulation, the commander asked. Marcus looked directly at him and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I watched Zorthok train for 6 months. The implications hit everyone at once. While they had been focused on displaying their own strength, the quiet human had been studying their weaknesses. Every training session he had observed in silence. Every combat drill he had watched without participating, he had been learning. Not just learning techniques, but learning how to defeat every species in the Academy. Dr. Kane arrived at the training facility within minutes of receiving Commander Vex High's emergency summons. The Academy's chief psychologist was a human herself. Though she had spent most of her career studying alien psychology, she found Marcus sitting alone in the debriefing room, writing in his notebook as if nothing unusual had happened. Asterisk. Marcus, she said, taking the seat across from him. The commander is concerned about your training methods. The other cadets are unsettled. Marcus looked up from his writing. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, he seemed ready to have an actual conversation. Dr. Kane, he said, his voice calm and measured, what do you know about human military history? I know we've had our share of conflicts, she replied carefully. We've been fighting wars for over 10,000 years, Marcus continued. Not against other species, but against ourselves. We've studied every possible form of combat, every strategic approach, every psychological warfare technique. We've learned to fight in every environment our planet could produce. Desert, jungle, Arctic, mountain, underwater, underground. We've fought with everything from stone tools to nuclear weapons. Dr. Kane leaned forward, beginning to understand where this was leading. But most importantly, Marcus said, closing his notebook, we learned that the best way to win a war is to understand your enemy better than they understand themselves. We learned to watch, to listen, to study, and to wait. We learned that silence can be more powerful than the loudest battle cry. He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the training grounds where other cadets continued their exercises. Every species in this academy fights the way their evolution taught them to fight. The Krillians use brute force because that's what worked on their homeworld. The Scions use mental attacks because physical combat was unnecessary for their development. The Hive Collective relies on coordination because their species survives through unity. Marcus turned back to face Dr. Kane. But humans learned to fight everyone. We learned to be stronger than the strong, smarter than the smart, more coordinated than the coordinated, and more vicious than the vicious. We learned to be whatever the situation required. And that's why you've been silent, Dr. Kane realized. I've been learning, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. That evening, word spread through the academy about the human cadet who had solved a combat simulation in under a minute without making a sound. Some of the cadets were impressed, others were intimidated, and a few were beginning to reconsider their assumptions about human capabilities. Zorthok found Marcus in the academy's observation deck, looking out at the stars through the massive viewport. The Krillian warrior approached with uncharacteristic caution. Human, he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. I have a question. Marcus didn't turn around, but he tilted his head slightly to indicate he was listening. If you could defeat the simulation so easily, why did you wait 6 months to show your abilities? Marcus was quiet for so long that Zorthok began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the massive warrior step back involuntarily, because in a real battle, you only get one chance to surprise your enemy. I wanted to make sure I understood everyone completely before I revealed what I could do. Zorthok felt a chill run down his armored spine. You were studying us. I was learning from you, Marcus corrected, all of you. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your habits, your fears. Information is the most powerful weapon in any conflict. The Krillian warrior looked out at the stars, processing this revelation. His species prized honor in combat, facing enemies directly and defeating them through superior strength. The idea of such patient, methodical observation felt almost predatory. What if there had been no real battle? Zorthok asked. What if the academy years had passed peacefully? Marcus finally turned to face him, and for the first time, the Krillian saw something in the human's eyes that made his warrior instincts scream warnings. Then I would have graduated knowing exactly how to defeat every military force in the galaxy, Marcus said simply. But I was hoping that wouldn't be necessary. The next morning brought news that would change everything at Nexus Military Academy. Long-range sensors had detected an unknown fleet approaching the system, moving too fast and with too much purpose to be anything other than hostile. The Academy's defensive systems activated automatically, but everyone knew that a training facility, even one as well-equipped as Nexus, wasn't designed to repel a serious military assault. Marcus sat in his usual corner of the cafeteria, eating breakfast and writing in his notebook as if nothing had changed. Around him, cadets from every species displayed their natural stress responses. The Krillians roared challenges at the ceiling. The Scions formed mental link clusters to share anxiety. The Hive collective members moved in tight formation patterns. Commander Vexhi's voice echoed through the Academy's communication system. All cadets report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. As the cafeteria emptied in controlled chaos, Marcus finished his meal methodically, closed his notebook, and walked calmly toward the tactical center. But unlike the other cadets who were rushing to defensive positions, he headed for the communications array. Dr. Kane found him there, standing in front of the main display screen that showed the approaching fleet. The ships were unlike anything in their databases, angular and aggressive, moving in attack formations that suggested extensive military experience. "Marcus," she said, "you should be with your emergency unit." He didn't turn around. "Dr. Kane, what do you know about human military doctrine regarding unknown threats?" Before she could answer, the first enemy ships entered weapons range, and Nexus Military Academy's greatest test was about to begin. When silence becomes thunder, the Academy's defensive shields flared to life as the first wave of enemy fire struck the outer perimeter. Emergency klaxons wailed through every corridor, and automated systems began sealing non-essential sections. In the main tactical center, Admiral Korath materialized via holographic transmission from the Galactic Defense Force headquarters. The ancient warrior had seen more battles than most species had recorded in their entire histories, and his scarred face showed immediate concern as he assessed the situation. "Commander Vexhi." The Admiral's gravelly voice filled the command center. "What's the status of your defensive capabilities?" "Shields at full power, weapons, systems online," the reptilian commander reported. "But Admiral, this is a training facility. We have defensive measures, but nothing designed for sustained combat against a fleet of this size." Through the tactical displays, they could see the enemy formation approaching with methodical precision. 37 ships of unknown design, moving in attack patterns that suggested experienced military leadership. The Academy sensors couldn't penetrate their hull compositions or identify their species, but their intentions were clear. In the communications section, Marcus had accessed the long-range scanner arrays and was studying the enemy fleet with intense concentration. Dr. Kane watched as he manipulated the display controls with practiced efficiency, analyzing ship movements, formation patterns, and approach vectors. "Marcus," she said quietly, "how do you know how to operate those systems?" "I've been watching the technicians for 6 months," he replied without looking away from the screens. "But that's not important right now." He pointed to a specific section of the enemy formation. "Dr. Kane, look at their attack pattern. Does anything about it seem familiar?" She studied the display, trying to see what Marcus had identified. The ships moved in coordinated waves, with smaller vessels protecting larger ones. Advanced scouts probing for weaknesses, while the main force maintained optimal firing positions. "It's very professional," she said. "Military precision, good tactical awareness. It's Krillian," Marcus said flatly. "Modified for space combat. But the basic formation principles are identical to what Zorthok has been demonstrating in training exercises for 6 months." The implications hit Dr. Kane immediately. If the attacking force was using Krillian military tactics, it meant they either were Krillians or had studied Krillian methods extensively. Either way, Marcus had been observing those exact same tactics. Every day during academy training, the first direct impact shook the entire station. Emergency power kicked in as primary systems fluctuated, and throughout the academy, cadets took their assigned positions. The Krillian students moved to defensive choke points, ready to meet any boarding parties with brute force. The Scions established mental coordination networks to share tactical information instantly. The Hive Collective members formed protective clusters around essential systems. Marcus walked calmly through the chaos toward the main command center. Other cadets barely noticed him, focused as they were on their own crisis responses. But Dr. Kane followed, curious to see what the quiet human planned to do. Commander Vex High was coordinating defensive measures when Marcus entered the command center. The reptilian instructor barely glanced at him before returning to his tactical displays. "Cadet, return to your emergency station," the commander ordered. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise with unexpected authority. "Request permission to address the tactical situation." Every head in the command center turned toward the human cadet who had just spoken more words in 10 seconds than he had in the previous month. Commander Vex High's yellow eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus's expression. "Cadet Thompson, this is not a training exercise." "No, sir," Marcus agreed. "It's exactly what I've been preparing for." Admiral Korath's holographic image focused on Marcus with sudden interest. The ancient warrior had learned to recognize dangerous individuals, and something about the quiet human's demeanor triggered his tactical instincts. "Commander," the Admiral said, "let the cadet speak." Marcus stepped forward to the main tactical display, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, he took command of a situation. The attacking fleet is using modified Krillian assault tactics. He began, manipulating the display controls to highlight specific ship movements. Formation 7, Variant 3, adapted for space combat but maintaining the core principles of overwhelming force concentrated at the enemy's weakest point. Commander Vex High stared at the analysis. "How could you possibly know Krillian military formations?" "Because I've been watching Zorthok practice them every day for 6 months, Marcus replied. "And because humans have been fighting wars for 10,000 years, we've learned to recognize patterns." He touched the display again, and the tactical projection shifted to show predicted enemy movements. "They'll probe our shields with the smaller ships first, looking for frequency harmonics that indicate generator locations. Once they identify our power sources, the main force will concentrate fire on 3 specific points to create a cascading failure." As if responding to his words, the enemy fleet began shifting into exactly the formation Marcus had predicted. "How long do we have?" Admiral Korath asked. Marcus studied the approaching ships for exactly 15 seconds. "If they maintain current, speed, and tactical doctrine, approximately 17 minutes before shield failure." "And you have a solution?" the Admiral pressed. For the first time since entering the command center, Marcus smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Sir, humans don't just study our enemies' tactics. We learn to turn their strengths into weaknesses." Marcus moved to the weapons control station, his fingers dancing across controls he had never been trained to use, but had apparently observed in operation many times. "The Krillian tactical doctrine has one fundamental weakness," he continued as he worked. "It assumes the enemy will respond predictably to overwhelming force. It's designed to fight opponents who will either flee or meet aggression with aggression. And humans don't do that," Commander Vex High asked. "Humans do whatever works." Marcus replied simply. He activated the Academy's long-range communication array and began broadcasting on frequencies that made every alien in the command center uncomfortable. The sounds emerging from the speakers were unlike anything they had ever heard, complex, rhythmic, almost musical, but with an underlying current that triggered primal fear responses in non-human listeners. "What is that?" Dr. Kane asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Human war songs," Marcus said without stopping his work. "Specifically, battle hymns from Earth's most successful military campaigns. We've learned that psychological warfare can be more effective than conventional weapons." The enemy fleet's formation began to waver. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination started showing signs of confusion. Their tight attack patterns loosened as individual vessels began making tactical adjustments that contradicted their overall strategy. "They're responding to auditory psychological triggers," Marcus explained. "Most species have evolved fear responses to certain sound frequencies. Humans learned to weaponize those responses thousands of years ago." Admiral Korath's image leaned forward with intense interest. "Cadet, what exactly are you doing to their fleet?" Marcus touched another control, and the Academy's defensive systems began operating in ways their designers had never intended. Instead of simply maintaining shields and firing defensive weapons, they began creating complex interference patterns that disrupted enemy targeting systems, while simultaneously broadcasting Marcus's psychological warfare signals with increasing intensity. "I'm making them afraid," Marcus said simply. "Fear makes even the best tactical doctrine fall apart." The enemy fleet, which had been approaching with methodical precision just minutes before, was now showing clear signs of disorganization. Ships were firing at targets their sensors couldn't properly identify, moving into positions that contradicted their formation requirements, and generally behaving like a coordinated force that had suddenly lost its coordination. "Sir," Marcus said, addressing Admiral Korath directly, "request permission to assume tactical command of Academy defenses." The ancient warrior studied the quiet human cadet for a long moment. In all his centuries of combat experience, he had learned to recognize the moment when conventional military thinking needed to be set aside in favor of something more innovative. "Permission granted, Cadet Thompson. Show us what humans do when they're not being quiet." What followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of space combat. Marcus began speaking in a voice that carried absolute authority, issuing orders to Academy personnel who had never heard him speak before but found themselves obeying without question. His commands were precise, economical, and devastatingly effective. "Tactical station, redirect shield harmonics to frequency 774. Weapons control, target enemy ship Delta 9 with disruption pulse, not destructive fire. Communications, increase psychological warfare broadcast intensity by 40% and add subsonic fear frequencies specifically, calibrated for reptilian neurological responses." The Academy's defensive systems, designed for basic protection, became something entirely different under Marcus's direction. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy fleet, he was systematically dismantling their ability to function as a coordinated military force. Engineering, reroute power from life support in non-essential sections to tactical systems. "We need maximum output for the next phase." "What's the next phase?" Commander Vex-High asked. Marcus looked at him with that same unsettling smile. "We're going to make them surrender." "Surrender? They outnumber us 37-1. Numbers don't matter when your enemy can't think clearly," Marcus replied. "Watch." He activated a new series of commands, and the Academy's communication array began broadcasting, something that made every alien in the command center step back involuntarily. The sounds were still recognizably human, but they carried harmonics and undertones that seemed to bypass conscious thought and trigger the deepest, most primal survival instincts. On the tactical display, the enemy fleet's formation collapsed entirely. Ships began firing on each other, their targeting systems confused by the electromagnetic interference Marcus had created. Others broke formation entirely and began retreating at maximum speed. Within minutes, the coordinated assault had become a chaotic rout. "Impossible," Admiral Korith whispered. "How did you turn a military fleet into a panicked mob?" Marcus began shutting down the systems he had commandeered, his movements efficient and precise. "Admiral, humans spent 10,000 years learning how to fight other humans. We discovered that the most effective way to win a war is to convince your enemy that fighting you is a mistake they don't want to make twice." He gestured toward the tactical display where the remaining enemy ships were fleeing the system at maximum speed. "Physical destruction is expensive and time-consuming. Psychological defeat is permanent and costs almost nothing." Commander Vex stared at the retreating fleet, then at Marcus, then back at the fleet. "Cadet Thompson, in 6 months of training, you never demonstrated any of these abilities." "Because in training, the goal is to learn," Marcus replied. "In combat, the goal is to win. I needed to understand every species in this academy before I could design psychological warfare effective against unknown enemies." Dr. Kane finally understood the full implications of what she had witnessed. "You used our own cadets as a reference database. You studied how each species responds to stress, fear, and confusion, then weaponized that knowledge against the attackers. Humans are very good at pattern recognition," Marcus said simply, "and we're even better at finding ways to use those patterns to our advantage." Admiral Korith's holographic image approached Marcus with something approaching reverence. "Cadet Thompson, I've been fighting wars for over 3 centuries. I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. A training academy with basic defensive systems just defeated a full military assault fleet without firing a single destructive shot." Marcus looked directly at the Admiral. "Sir, respectfully, that's because you've been thinking about warfare the wrong way. Most species fight to destroy their enemies. Humans fight to make their enemies not want to fight us anymore." He moved toward the exit, then paused and turned back to address the entire command center. "I've been quiet for 6 months because I needed to learn how everyone else approaches conflict. Now I understand why humans are going to be very successful in this galaxy." "And why is that, Cadet?" Admiral Korith asked. Marcus's expression became perfectly serious. "Because while every other species has been perfecting their strengths, humans have been learning everyone else's weaknesses. We don't need to be the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced. We just need to be the most adaptable." He looked around the command center one more time, making eye contact with each person present. "The enemy fled because I made them afraid of something they didn't understand. But the really frightening thing, from their perspective, is that they were right to be afraid. They just don't know why yet." As Marcus left the command center, walking with the same quiet efficiency he had displayed for 6 months, everyone present realized they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Not just a military victory, but a demonstration of a completely different approach to warfare. Dr. Kane followed him into the corridor, her mind racing with implications. "Marcus," she called, "what happens now?" He stopped and turned back to her. Now I go back to being quiet and watching. There's still a lot to learn, but everyone knows what you're capable of now." Marcus considered this for a moment. "Dr. Kane, do you know why humans are called the quiet species by most of the galaxy?" She shook her head. "Because the loudest warriors are usually the ones who are trying to convince themselves they're dangerous. The truly dangerous ones don't need to make noise." He smiled, and for the first time, it was a warm, genuine expression, rather than the unsettling tactical smile he had worn during the battle. "Besides, I wasn't the only human at this academy. I was just the only one you noticed being quiet." Dr. Kane felt a chill as she realized the implication. "There are other humans here." "Dr. Kane," Marcus said gently, "you're human too. And you just spent 6 months watching me study alien psychology while you were studying alien psychology yourself. Did you think that was a coincidence?" As he walked away down the corridor, Dr. Kane stood frozen in realization. The Academy hadn't admitted one quiet human observer. They had admitted dozens of humans, all of whom had been quietly learning, studying, and preparing. Marcus had just been the most obvious about it. In the command center behind her, Admiral Korath was already drafting reports that would change how the Galactic Defense Force approached human integration. The quiet species had just demonstrated that they were anything but weak. And in dormitories throughout the academy, human cadets who had spent months appearing unremarkable began to smile quietly to themselves. The demonstration phase was over. Now the real learning could begin. Asterisk.